to the Impostor Syndrome Files. I am so grateful that you're here, and I really hope that you've been enjoying the conversations that you've been listening to, and hopefully finding some tips, some next steps that you can take if you struggle with similar feelings of self-doubt, which obviously, as you're hearing, are fairly universal. This is something that we all go through from time to time. When I started this podcast, my goal was really to try to normalize the experience, to let everybody know that you are not alone, that there's a name for what you're feeling, and that there are steps that we can be taking to manage it more effectively. What I have found over the course of these conversations has been fascinating. I have had an absolutely powerful and different conversation with every single person who I have interviewed. I worried at one point that there may not be enough to talk about. How much is there to say about imposter syndrome? Are the stories going to start to get repetitive? That has absolutely not been the case. Everyone brings a fascinating new perspective to this conversation. I have learned something from every discussion that we've had. I hope you have too. I want to make a note that many of these recordings are being done during the social distancing that's happening with coronavirus. I am doing my best to protect the sound quality, but we are all in homes that have pets, kids, all kinds of background noise going on. For me, it's much more important to share with you a very natural conversation between two people than it is to share a perfectly polished recording. So I hope that you will bear with us if there are moments where the sound is not perfect. Really, my goal is to share stories, not to provide perfectly scripted, perfectly polished audio. So apologies for any imperfections that may be coming through in the recordings, but I'm hoping that you're getting the essence of the message regardless. So thank you again for being here. I wish you all the best and hope that you will consider sharing your own story one day. Thanks again. Welcome, Deb. Thank you so much for being here today. Before we start, I would love to just invite you to share a little bit about yourself, whatever you're feeling comfortable sharing with the listeners.
Okay, thank you, Kim. Thank you again for inviting me to participate in this. I think this is an incredible effort and so needed. Such an important topic. My name is Deb Doroni. I am an executive and leadership coach. I generally work with healthcare leaders to help them really crush it in their career without it crushing them. I have a particular interest around supporting people to, avoid burnout, which is incredibly prevalent in the healthcare industry. I was a healthcare executive myself for almost 30 years and found my way to coaching because I was burnt out. And so to me, that's really important. And I think imposter syndrome is part of the challenge around burnout. So I think this is a great opportunity to shed some light on that.
And what a great place for you to be in terms of supporting others right now, because you're absolutely right. I hear that a lot about the stress, the burnout, the need for additional support in the healthcare space. And I think it's only going to get worse, especially right now. I mean, you and I are talking in the midst of the coronavirus challenges and chaos that's going on around us. And I can only imagine what it must feel like for the people who are grappling with the healthcare crisis right now.
Yeah, completely crazy. Although I think there may be some silver linings that, come out of this whole thing where there's some learning that we can experiment with new ways of doing things and it actually worked. And so they may result in some improvements.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see that for sure. So you mentioned imposter syndrome, which is obviously why we're here today. What does that mean to you? What comes up for you when you hear that term, imposter syndrome, and how, if at all, has it affected you throughout your own journey?
Yeah, so To me, imposter syndrome is sort of that feeling you get when the little voice inside your head shows up as the mean girl who says things like, you can't possibly do that, or you don't know enough to do that, or, who do you think you are that you think you could do that? And I think it also shows up in other people's insecurities and judgments, like when they say, what are you, crazy? You're walking away from your job as an executive after 30 years? I don't think you're ready for that. Or I hear my clients, they're only going to want candidates with Ivy League educations or 10 years of experience or whatever. Those are other people's judgments, and they get into our heads. I think it also shows up as for me personally, as a downplaying or undervaluing what I'm capable of. Thinking that the things I'm really good at are no big deal and kind of taking them for granted. How it affected me in my career, it definitely kept me from going after new jobs. I hit a sort of a glass ceiling in the organization I worked for nearly 20 years at Mass General. And in many ways, it was a glass ceiling of my own making. I kind of played it too safe, stayed comfortable, rather than challenging and stretching myself. I let other people determine what I was and wasn't capable of, instead of deciding that for myself and really proactively going after what I wanted. So for me, it was really about not trusting myself and not valuing what I was capable of.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that there's so many people who can relate to what you're saying. And certainly as you started by sharing those voices that we hear, right? The inner voice, the outer voices that have such a powerful influence on how we see ourselves and the decisions that we make. It's really challenging to navigate all of those internal and external influences, especially when we're in the moment, because we're not even necessarily consciously aware that there is that impact, that we are making those choices to stay safe, to not stretch ourselves like you're describing. Do you think that you were aware of that in the moment, or is that something that you have reflected on more in hindsight?
I think much more in hindsight, so throughout my career, I would watch colleagues leave the organization and take bigger jobs at other places. And I would think, oh, I could never do that. But I was running a $200 million, 1,000-person enterprise. What made me think I couldn't, be the COO of a small facility, right? And so I just, at the time, I think I had too many other people's voices in my head and not my own.
You brought up a really good point too about undervaluing your own strengths. I think that's something that so many women in particular struggle with, is that feeling that what we do well is not necessarily special. That, well, yeah, sure, anybody can do that, or that's not a big deal, but what so-and-so can do, that's amazing, right? And so we're comparing ourselves to other people, always looking for the ways in which we don't measure up, or where we have some type of deficiency. And that always overshadows all of the things that we actually do well, and the value that we do have to offer.
Yeah. And I think we're also, and I definitely see this more in my female clients than male clients, we seem to have a much greater need to feel like an expert at something in order to feel like we are a candidate. We have to have all the bases covered, have all the answers.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I say to my clients too, who start to question whether they have every single requirement in a job description, is, if you have already mastered every feature of that job description, then you're overqualified and you don't belong there.
Right. And it never occurred to me at the time to question those thoughts, or to think, well, maybe you don't have to have all the answers. Maybe you don't have all the answers, but you don't have to have all the answers. I think it's an old-fashioned notion of what good leadership means.
Yeah. And I think there is definitely, like you said, a gender difference here. And I've read a lot about the difference in how girls and boys are socialized academically, the pressure that we put on ourselves in academic environments, and also the ways in which boys and girls are rewarded or punished for different behaviors. And so I think that a lot of that mindset of taking an academic approach to the workplace stems from those childhood experiences.
Yeah. And for sure, I mean, healthcare is academic, right? And that expert mindset was really so prevalent. And I think it also, in the context of healthcare, it keeps a lot of clinicians from being the best possible service to their patients. As they inflict their idea of what the answer should be on the patient and don't really then engage the patient and their family in kind of co-creating a picture of success. And I think that's how a lot of leaders show up with their teams, in every industry.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that is challenging too, because one of the things I was talking about with someone else recently is there's a certain level of comfort that comes with that academic sort of expert approach to your job, to leadership, what have you. And it takes a certain amount of courage to go outside of the lines, right? To be more spontaneous, more creative. And if you are somebody who really leans on the rigidity and structure of a certain domain, you're not as flexible, right? There's less flexibility baked in to do what you're describing, which is to actually talk with a family and see what their thoughts are, right? And it takes some vulnerability too, right? To say, I may not have all of the answers right now. I'm looking for you to collaborate with me in this effort.
Yeah. And for sure, I think that's one of the biggest challenges in leadership in general, is that the leader shows up with a preconceived notion of what the outcome needs to look like, or the how needs to look like, instead of, here's where we want to get, help us. How do we do that? Should we do that? How do we do that? Instead of showing up with a questioning mindset. And it's a hard habit to break.
Yeah,
for sure.
Absolutely. And I don't want to speak for you, but I can certainly say for myself that I learned a lot from my own work experience, having been in the corporate world for a number of years before I became a coach, and being able to now see from a distance things very differently from how I saw them when I was on the ground. And so I would imagine that that's likely true for you too. How does that experience that you had influence now the way that you engage with your own clients and support them through these types of challenges?
Well, I think, it certainly allows me to show up with a fair amount of empathy and a new perspective, and, to help model that, that's what we do as coaches, is sort of model that inquiry and that not making assumptions, and let's make sure we're really clear on what's behind our intentions here. And I mean that on the client's behalf. And so it's certainly, having shifted to that perspective, I think it allows me to show up in a more effective way as a coach, I hope. And to model that behavior as a way that, leaders can then take back to their teams.
And I think so much of this has to do, as we've been talking about, with self-awareness too. And sometimes when we're going 90 miles an hour and just moving through life with all of the different things that are thrown our way, it's really hard to be reflective. It's hard to even notice that you're responding to those voices, whether they're internal or external, like we talked about. And so I think probably you and I would both agree that just giving people a space to pause and recognize where these feelings might be coming up and how they may be disruptive is a benefit in and of itself.
Absolutely. And in our fear of missing out society, and I know you and I work in similar spaces, in that we work with leaders who are they're high achievers. They take a big bite out of life. They're interested in a lot of things. They want to make a big impact in the world. They want to serve as many people as possible. And so that you end up in a mode of, overemphasizing doing and getting things done at the expense of that reflective being, planning thoughtfully about how you want to show up. And then most importantly, and probably most neglected, debriefing yourself afterwards. What went well, what didn't go well, where was I making assumptions, or where am I making assumptions that I don't really have data to back up? How can I ask for that data from my team or others?
Absolutely. I think that's such an important point. And it's interesting because I talk a lot about that from the perspective of empowering people to have a more strategic mindset for their own career advancement purposes, right? Mm-hmm. So that they can achieve the level of leadership that they're striving for. But it goes so far beyond that. The ability to get outside of the day-to-day reactive mode that we all find ourselves in has so many important benefits to our own lives and to our own level of satisfaction with the work that we do.
Yeah. And just from a learning standpoint, like you and I were chatting before we started this podcast about another experience I had doing a podcast that I walked away, a little uncomfortable. And when I really took the time to sit, I sat down, just started riffing on my computer, what made me uncomfortable. And I really thought about it and got really clear on, what I would do differently next time. And so I had such a great learning opportunity. So something that may have felt a little bit negative turned out to be a great learning opportunity. And I think, you can do that probably 100 times a day with any interaction or any decision you make or any meeting you go to where you say, now, how did that go? Well, if it went well, what went well about it? What did I get out of it that made me think it went well? And if it didn't go well, why is that? And why is that bothering me? And you just, it's such a learning opportunity, well beyond, I think, any books you can read or even podcasts you can listen to is sort of tapping into your own wisdom. And as you say, that's what, as coaches, we give clients the space to do exactly that.
That is such a great recommendation to everybody listening, is to really take that time to tune in to those experiences and to reflect. Why am I feeling this way? Like you said, what is making me uncomfortable? Why was that such an uncomfortable experience? What am I taking away from it? And it requires a certain level of consciousness, intentionality, and time to be able to do that. And so I certainly don't want to suggest that that's going to be so time intensive that it's going to take away from the other responsibilities that we have. I actually think that if you can bake it in very intentionally to your routine, it creates more time because you're more aware and you have more sort of mindfulness. No mindfulness expert here, but I think just in terms of the language, just in how you approach new situations going forward, you're more prepared, you're more purposeful about how you engage in future activities. Like you said to me about that same podcast, I didn't ask for what I needed. Well, now next time, if you don't get what you were hoping for from that previous experience, you now know what to ask for.
Exactly. And what you walk away with from that kind of reflection is a much higher level of confidence and less fear. And, isn't that a little bit of what imposter syndrome in part is about, those two things? And so, as you say, especially in our doing world, it's really hard to find the time. And so, for sure, getting really clear on your values and your goals and your strengths, and listening to when you're hearing yourself say, oh, I don't have the time for that, or I should do this, and really start to question and that's where you make the time, is when you say, well, this is a nice to have, but not a need to have. This reflective, this time for my own growth is a must have,
Yeah, that's right. Make it non-negotiable. And it doesn't have to, like we said, doesn't have to take too long, but just carve out a few minutes at the beginning of every day or at lunchtime, the end of every day, to just check in with yourself and see how you're feeling and where that's coming from. And eventually it will become more natural. You won't even notice it. You won't have to carve out dedication.
And it gives you so much more choice and confidence, is the best way I can describe it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, you described a career for 30 years in the healthcare industry. Now you're coaching, you're working for yourself, I presume, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you experience imposter syndrome at all, if at all, today? Do you see it creeping up on you in different situations in your current experience?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think where it shows up a lot for me is around, when I need to do business development, for example. Trying to get out there and speak and network, and for sure those are areas where it still creeps up on me. And so I really have to notice when I'm kind of shooting myself down or getting in my own way, and ask myself, what the mean girl is trying to protect me from, who doesn't want me to go to that networking event, or who doesn't feel like going to that networking event, and really, and I think focusing on my intent too helps me break free of that. Again, it's that reflective, really getting clear on, I'm not just going to this networking event to build my business. I'm going to this networking event because I want to have a bigger impact in the world and help other people break free of maybe situations that are limiting them. Right. And so when I think that way, it gets that imposter girl to sit down on the back bench for a while.
That's such a great point. I often emphasize that too, the importance of really understanding your values and your purpose. Because if you don't know why you're doing something at the deeper level, like you said, not just because you want to go to a networking event and meet people who may become clients, but that deeper purpose of why are we here? Why are we doing what we do today? It's so much easier to fall into the comfort zone trap, to talk ourselves out of things, to listen to the mean girl in our head, right? But if we know why we're doing what we're doing, and I think this is true for anybody, it doesn't have to be somebody who's an entrepreneur, but you can have a deeper purpose working within a massive corporation, right? We all have our reasons for doing what we do. Then we can find the courage much more easily in some intimidating situations to go after what we want, because that deeper desire, that goal outweighs the pain or discomfort that might come with the steps that we need to take to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So is there anything else that you feel is helpful for people to think about as they're going through their own experience with imposter syndrome? I know there's certain work environments that seem to trigger imposter syndrome more so than others, whether it's, toxic work cultures, sometimes it's the diversity or lack thereof. Are there things that you see within your own clients that tend to trigger imposter syndrome more so than others?
Yeah, and I think because I do tend to work with a lot of people in the healthcare field, I think it's that expert mentality.
Mm.
Um, I have a background in ballet. I danced with the Boston Ballet when I was a teenager,
Oh, wow.
and I notice in a lot of my clients, if they were ballet dancers or gymnasts or ice skaters, those sort of aesthetic athletics, I guess, where really perfection is the standard.
Mm.
Or when you say toxic work cultures, perfectionism shows up in a toxic work culture, right? That's where there's not freedom to experiment. The stakes are too high for taking risks. You can't, you don't have the opportunity to learn from quote failures. And I think in those situations, we just get very focused on, what can we do better? What went wrong? Um, I think there's that tendency to really seek out and thrive in some ways on criticism
Mm.
versus, focusing on what we do well and how do we leverage that and what went well in a situation and giving people space to learn from mistakes or challenges versus having the consequences feel too high.
That is so interesting. It makes perfect sense to me. I have never done ballet or gymnastics or anything like that. So I haven't experienced it personally, but certainly having heard stories and, known people in those spaces, I can completely see how that would play a role in your mindset forever. I mean, it's got to be something that you're kind of, if you recognize it and see it as something that has been disruptive, have to kind of consciously rewire against.
Yeah, and in specific to the ballet world, at least back when I was involved, I don't know if it's still this way today, but you were actually told that you wanted the teacher to criticize you because that meant that you were good enough to be worth, his or her attention. And so you'd actually seek out criticism and kind of thrive on it. And I don't know if that, if it's a chicken and an egg, right? Did that tendency cause me and others to be attracted to that art form, or did that art form create it? But,
Mm.
I absolutely see that playing out in the business world where we just tend to, you know, even how feedback is delivered. We tend to focus on what somebody needs to do better and what's not working well. And we, spend maybe 15 seconds of a performance evaluation, talking about all the things that are going right and, what the person's what the impact is that they want to have, as opposed to, we spend time on what they're doing right or wrong around what, we believe to be right or wrong. That sort of perfectionist tendency. It's sort of where a superpower can actually become a kryptonite, right? Because
Yeah.
that desire to do better, is what helps us, motivates many people. And it can also become, that can really feed the imposter syndrome for sure.
Yeah, you really got me thinking about that too, because I think that really connects to the idea of having a purpose and having deeper values too, because if your rationale for wanting to get better is to make other people happy, to get the feedback or favor of the influencers around you, you're never going to have enough of it. It's never going to feel motivating enough. You're always going to question yourself. But if, again, the desire to get better comes from a place of being able to fulfill that purpose more meaningfully, that has a very different feel to it as we go about our regular lives.
Yeah, what a fantastic insight, Kim. Yeah, for sure. Right.
It's just now the challenge is how do we get there, right? And
Right.
I think to your point about the structures that we operate within on a daily basis, in some sense they are what they are, and there's a limit to how much we personally can control. But what we can control in this conversation that we're having is the time we take to really reflect for ourselves. And I think this comes full circle in this conversation, right? Of really being intentional about how we think about our own strengths, how we become more intentional about what we want. And I think that will hopefully neutralize a bit more some of the more negative aspects of the work environments that we're in.
Yeah. Yes. And allow us to sort of weather it a little bit. So I remember even in my own experience in another company, our reward structure, our incentive program had a significant component that really was about pushing the numbers, right? It was a for-profit company. That has to happen. And at the same time, I knew I had started in this role relatively new, and I knew that I had a team that was disconnected. And so I probably spent way more time than perhaps some of my colleagues on really trying to rebuild the connection among that team and helping them feel more grounded and supported, and less time focusing on the financial results, to my own detriment, right? Not getting my bonus. But to me, that felt like an important, long-term strategy of needing to, help get the team to a place where ultimately we would all be, better able to achieve results.
Yeah, that is disheartening in so many ways, the focus on short-term results at the expense of the things that really matter and the things that really will have a powerful effect on the long-term numbers. The incentive structures are designed in such a way to reward that immediate behavior, even if it means, like in your situation, right, losing trust, losing people, having to then go next quarter and start all over again with a new team. I don't have the answer. Certainly it's complicated, but I really do believe that we can all do more for ourselves by taking a longer term perspective on our own lives and why we're here and what we want from this experience. And, hopefully systems will catch up at some point, but in the meantime, let's empower ourselves where we can.
That's right. Well, and if you're in a position at all to impact the system,
that's right.
Do so, right?
Exactly.
Really, we all are, from wherever we are in an organization, we have an ability to lead. And so, making those kind of deliberate, reflective choices, as we've been talking about.
Absolutely. So what motivated you to want to tell your story today? What is it that you're hoping people will take away from this?
Well, first of all, that I hope there's some comfort that they're not alone, that many of us have imposter syndrome, even if it might not look like it on the outside. And, I by no means profess to be cured of it. I think it's a lifelong struggle, and it's a matter of kind of making friends with it and figuring out when it's helping and when it's not helping, to have that mean girl voice on my shoulder, right? I also hope that anyone who thinks they don't have it because they're comfortable, might be inspired to push out of their comfort zone a little bit because, as I said, I think it's like any other superpower. It can be a blessing and a curse. And so I think it can be a blessing too. And so if you're too comfortable, what maybe do you need to push yourself to feel a little uncomfortable and a little bit like a quote imposter? Mm-hmm. And I do hope that people will start to pay attention to that sort of that inner voice and notice when it shows up and recognize when it is and isn't serving them, and that they don't have to believe everything that they hear in their head, essentially.
I love that. And I have loved this conversation, Deb. Thank you so much. I feel like I could talk to you about this all day, but
I know.
I really want to thank you for your great insights, and am grateful that you were willing to take the time to share your story with us.
Well, thank you so much. I'm incredibly grateful to have the opportunity, and I can't wait to hear the podcast series.
Thank you so much for listening today. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share it with other women who can benefit from this conversation. Before we go, I want to share some additional resources with you. If you struggle with imposter syndrome and you want to manage it more effectively, I invite you to join my free Impostor Syndrome online challenge. Every day for 7 days, you'll get an email with self-reflection questions and exercises to help you better understand your own experience with imposter syndrome and how to navigate it more effectively. To join the free challenge, visit executivecareersuccess.com/imposter-syndrome-challenge. When you sign up, you'll immediately receive your first message. Also, if you're interested in joining a community of women who engage in candid conversations that generally aren't happening elsewhere, I invite you to join my Leading Women discussion group. On the first and third Thursday of every month at 12 p.m. Eastern, we meet virtually over Zoom to talk about questions or challenges related to career management, leadership development, and any other relevant topics such as imposter syndrome and confidence. It's always a great discussion with a great group of women. If you want to check it out, you're welcome to be my guest on a future call. Just reach out to me at kim@executivecareersuccess.com, and I will share the call details with you. And if you want to join my newsletter to receive tips, insights, and updates, text Leading Women, all one word, to 66866. Finally, consider telling us your story. Contact me to learn more about how you can be a guest on the Imposter Syndrome Files. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day.